Hello and welcome to lecture number 27, Diasporic Connections, Slavery and Freedom in Brazil. There are two learning objectives, and the first one is to describe the features of enslavement of Africans abroad. We're going to focus on Brazil today, and the practice of enslaving Africans in Brazil started in the middle of the 16th century. Prior to that, the Portuguese started with the enslavement of natives, though natives had a shorter lifespan because of their lack of immune defenses to European diseases. Despite that, native enslavement did continue into the 17th and 18th centuries by the Portuguese. The Portuguese began exploring Brazil in the early 1500s, and by 1530, they established their first permanent settlements. Brazil was the biggest destination for all those who were enslaved in the Atlantic slave trade. Nearly half of those who survived the Middle Passage arrived in Brazil, and that number is 5.5 million. Most of them embarked from Luanda in modern-day Angola of Central West Africa. The first recorded shipment of enslaved Africans to Brazil was in 1538. 70% of all the migrants to the colony in its first 250 years were enslaved Africans. This means that not only did they outnumber the European planters, but they also had a short lifespan. Therefore, the slave trade was a means to replenish the dying laborers. They were forced to work in various enterprises that waxed and waned over the centuries, depending on what the most profitable product was in the European economy. First, they were made to work in sugar plantations because that was the most lucrative crop from the 1600s to the 1650. In the 1690s, the Portuguese found gold in other parts of Brazil, so enslaved Africans were then used to extract and smelt the gold from the ore. Brazil's gold rush began in 1693 in the region of Minas Gerais. They also worked in coffee plantations in the 1830s when that became a major export for the colony. Coffee overtook sugar as Brazil's leading export by the mid-19th century. And in the 1750s, cattle ranching and food production for local consumption started to be a larger part of the economy, so they were used for that too. The average enslaved African lived to be 23 in Brazil, which is why they continued to import so many and eventually reached the figure of 5.5 million. Those who arrived in Brazil were able to maintain some aspects of cultural practices from Africa and incorporate them into their new lives in the Brazilian colony. The first one that we'll look at is capoeira, which is a martial art that somewhat resembles a dance developed by enslaved Africans. Capoeira was developed during the 16th century and became a symbol of resistance against oppression. Sometimes it's been described as a form of self-defense disguised as a dance, so it was a way for them to train in methods of self-defense covertly. But it combines music and call-response singing, and the primary motion is called the ginga, which is a rocking step. So the person performing the capoeira is rocking back and forth for the purpose of deceiving their combatant, not giving away whether they're going to attack, feint, or divert an incoming attack. Other moves include kicking, headbutting, evasions, and acrobatics, things that look like cartwheels. The emphasis is normally placed on the interaction between the kicks and the evasion and how they flow together, which determines what a good capoeira performance looks like. We said that it was to serve as a form of self-defense, but it also had some spiritual motives. In the Bantu religion, the concept of kalunga, or the inverted worldview, means that the ancestors or spirits have an inversion of qualities compared to people here in the mortal world. So, when a dancer puts himself in an inverted position during the dance, he is able to touch the ground upside down, thereby being inverted and able to draw strength from their ancestors. Across the 17th and 18th centuries in Brazil, this dance was a form of self-defense, severely policed and then also outlawed, so it had to be performed and practiced in secret for the most time in which slavery was legal in Brazil. In 1890, 2 years after the abolition of slavery, capoeira was outlawed again in Brazil, and those caught practicing it faced severe punishment. The rationale by the Brazilian government at the time was that it was associated with gangs and criminal activity. The second practice is the congada, and this is a celebration of the King of Congo and Our Lady of the Rosary. It is a syncretic religious practice that mixes elements of African culture and Catholicism. It's a procession or parade with people wearing white and then colorful accessories in which people dance, play music, and bang drums as they make their way to a church for a coronation ceremony to commemorate the coronation of the King of Congo. Also, sometimes the coronation of Queen Nzinga is celebrated, depending on the region of Brazil. This was actually a practice that was generally tolerated by the enslavers due to the Catholic influences inside of the celebration. The dates vary on when this is celebrated based on the patron saints that the majority of the people ascribe to it. The Congada festival has been celebrated in Brazil since the 18th century and continues to be celebrated today. The second learning objective says to explain shifts in the numbers of enslaved Africans in Brazil and the United States during the 19th century. We're going to compare these two numbers, starting with Brazil. By the late 1800s, the enslaved population in Brazil was about 15% of the total population, so they were 1.5 million out of the 10 million total black or mulatto population. 4 million of them were free, which means that 75% of the total black or mulatto population was also free. Through the 19th century, the number of enslaved Africans actually decreased in Brazil, and the free black population grew. There were several reasons for this. The first one is that there was an increase in the frequency of manumission. People were giving their freedom by the enslavers because the practice of slavery continued to become more expensive, especially in instances of drought or bad harvests. There was also the influence of Iberian laws and the Catholic Church, which generally frowned upon slavery, especially if the person being enslaved was Catholic. Because of the Central African origins of most of the people who were enslaved, many had converted to Catholicism before they even arrived in Brazil and had to toil under slavery. The final blow came in 1888 when Brazil abolished slavery with the signing of the Golden Law by Princess Isabel. By this point, every other country in the Americas had abolished it, so Brazil was the last. As we said before, another reason for the end of the slave trade or the practice of slavery in Brazil was because it was no longer profitable. Immigrant labor was starting to replace enslaved labor as a cheaper option for plantation owners and later on factory owners. To compare this with the United States, they ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. Right before they abolished it in 1808, in the preceding 20 years, the United States imported the largest number of enslaved people than they had in any other 20-year period in their history. From 1808 until the institution of slavery was abolished, the number of enslaved Africans increased. One reason for this was the slave code Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which meant that the children of enslaved people were also born into enslavement and owned by the person who enslaved their mother. The second reason for this is that cotton, which was growing in large amounts in the United States, replaced sugar as the most lucrative crop in the Atlantic economy. Author Howard W. French, who wrote the book Born in Blackness, compares the United States in the 1800s to Saudi Arabia and its large oil deposits today to emphasize how lucrative the raw material was in the world economy. By the time the Civil War started and the Emancipation Proclamation and later on the 13th Amendment put an end to slavery, there were nearly 4 million enslaved Africans in the United States, and they made up 50% of all the enslaved people in the Americas. And finally, here's the recap. Brazil received the largest number of enslaved Africans through the history of the Atlantic slave trade. Syncretic cultural and religious practices like capoeira and the congada were preserved in Brazil. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, though it was in decline when it did so. Conversely, the United States increased its practice of slavery up until the point that it abolished it in 1865. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.